Okay. Thanks. Okay, it's just time for the lecture. Hi, everyone. Hope you had a good weekend. Yeah, so I put up the answers to the quiz from last week, Friday. So if you didn't see that, have a look. It's just also good for your own learning because then you understand why some of the answers are wrong, why the right answers were right. I haven't finished marking yet, but I'm marking varying levels of just the marks are like probably around about 6 on average out of 10, just for at least one section, so 1/6 of the class. But anyway, I need to think about, I'll speak with the other lecturers. Are they usually, do you get feedback on marks very quickly for quizzes and things like that, or do you expect to kind of, okay, yeah, so I'll get a spreadsheet together and then put something up on Are You Connected probably by the end of this week, and then I'll keep that updated just so you are aware of how your quiz marks are doing. Okay, so today we're looking at 2 ways of analyzing, not quite SLA, but ways of analyzing phenomena that were very popular at the beginning of SLA as a thing. So this is kind of historical, going into the history of SLA theory. And from this, we can see where some of the theory that we have today, that maybe in the next lecture or further on in the course, where it emerged from. So particularly contrastive analysis had a whole bunch of theoretical underpinnings that went with it that were kind of debunked, but it's the starting point. And as with most theories, you have to start somewhere. Okay. Yeah, if there's kind of seats in the center, I see there's quite a few people who need to get in. You can just kind of move inwards. Okay. All right, so I'm also going to have to go pretty quickly because I'm trying to compress these 2 modes of analysis into this lecture. And then you'll see for the tutorial, there's a third thing. I am including universal grammar or Chomsky's kind of views as applied to second language learning, but that's only relevant for the tutorial. It'll be in your reading. Okay, so today we're just looking at contrastive analysis and error analysis, and they go together well. So you'll see 2 ways of analyzing user, like second language learner speech, with a focus, I guess, on errors. In the case of error analysis, it's pretty straightforward. But then also contrastive analysis, you just look at that word, there's a contrast and compare going on between, probably it would be the first language and the second language. And that gives you a sense of what these modes of analysis do. Okay, so we will get into some examples. Otherwise, there's going to be more just kind of going through the key points of what these forms of analysis are. But yeah, we're going to speed today. There's going to be quite a bit of content, so do your best. Okay, so contrastive analysis focuses in on first language and second language and comparing the structures of both of those two languages, whatever they are, to figure out where there would be, for instance, interference and problems emerging, or for instance, where there would be transfer, so positive language transfer like we saw last week, where things would be really easy between your first and second language. And I mean, this is then looked at multiple levels of language, so whether phonology, grammar, vocabulary, morphology, etc., etc. So one of the assumptions, and this is where you'll see kind of, I mean, obviously this is a form of analysis as opposed to a theory, but it has assumptions that are theoretical. So and like a theory was, as we're built upon contrastive analysis. It's a bit of a bad name. It's not easy to get immediately what kind of theory it is. But yeah, so I think the first thing to look at is just that it views language learning as habit formation. Maybe someone could just say, is there a theory that we've looked at previously, particularly in first language learning, that views language learning as habit formation? You can shout it out. Starts with a B. Okay, so that's very much how the behaviorists saw things, that there's stimulus, response, reinforcement, you learn habits. And language learning is just forming habits. So this is an assumption of contrastive analysis. And then what happens is your habits of, in effect, how I would express X in my mother tongue, I will then probably use that same habit of communication when I try to do things in the second language. So that's the assumption. And there can be some positive ones, for instance, where your first language and second language, there's similarities between them, and they can kind of facilitate your first language can facilitate your ability to develop good habits in your second language. So for instance, Spanish lenguajes and English languages, very similar. In Spanish, you also would pluralize it with putting an S at the end, like in English, at least most of the time in English. And you can also see that the word roots, there's lenguajes and languages, there's similarities in the spelling. They come from the same Latin root. And then also with word order, with Spanish as well. So yo como una manzana or manzana, I eat an apple. So I eat una manzana, an apple. So it has all the elements that you have in English. I eat an apple. All four of those things are present. So that's some habits that can be transferred across when there's positive language transfer, right? But then there's also negative habits. And this is where your way of saying things that you're used to in your first language interfere. So for instance, when they would qualify or say what kind of language, they want to say modern languages, they would put modernas, lenguajes modernas at the end. So they put the adjective at the end as opposed to, so this would be where it would actually get in the way. And then they might say things like, I learn languages modern. And that would, according to this, be because they just had the habit of always putting the adjective at the end. All right. Another one would be in Japanese, the subject, object, verb is normal for them. They would put the object before the verb. In English, it's the other way around. So that would be another way where if you were learning Japanese or vice versa, a Japanese person were learning English, according to contrastive analysis, you might struggle, there might be interference. And in terms of why there are errors, it's because obviously contrastive suggests that we are comparing and looking at differences. And the idea is that when there are greater differences, when the differences are very big, then there will be greater difficulty. And I mean, when we're talking about second language learning, one of the main things that comes up is it's not an easy thing. It doesn't happen like first language learning, it's difficult, right? So explaining the difficulty is one of the things that contrastive analysis tries to do. Because, yeah, and this is another thing about theories, we don't really develop theories about things that are just straightforward and easy to understand, right? So because second language acquisition is difficult, that's why we want to build a theory, because there's probably lots of complex parts that we need to understand how they work. So this is one way of trying to describe difficulty and why there is difficulty in this phenomenon. Okay, so some of the objectives, they want to look at similarities and differences. They want to try and also maybe certainly explain, and if they can, predict problems that will emerge, particularly if you have a certain first language, say you're a Spanish first language speaker, they would want to predict, well, you're trying to learn English. And if we do a contrastive analysis of these two languages, you're probably going to have issues here, 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 and here. Okay, so that's where prediction comes in. We'll come to that later, where the prediction works actually with contrastive analysis. And then another objective is just to, okay, I'll try and have to shout. Actually, can we close that window? Actually, it doesn't matter. Don't worry, I'll just shout. Don't worry about it. Yeah, also developing course materials. So this came on pretty early on. This was in the behaviorist era, which was in the 40s and the 50s. So there was a need to develop course materials because for a long time there had been an established way of doing it, which was taken from the classical era. The way you would teach Latin or Greek was the way that in a school you'd focus on the grammar, you'd focus on doing translation exercises. And I think there was a sense that if we teach in languages that people actually speak, why on earth should we use the same methodology that we've used to teach dead languages that people don't speak anymore? So in the 40s and 50s, there was an explosion of kind of theorizing, of trying to understand how language works. Psychology was also really getting going as a discipline, so there were overlaps there. And there's obviously a pedagogical or an educational implication of how people learn languages and the difficulty and overcoming difficulty. So that's why contrastive analysis was often used, this form of analysis, to create language learning materials, to give methodologies for teachers. Can you guys hear me at the back? Am I, oh, shucks, okay. What do you usually do if this happens? Do I get a microphone out? I can try. Okay. Okay, it's going to take me too long to figure out how to get this thing to work. So I think we do have to close those windows. Otherwise, you can't hear. I don't see a normal microphone. Can you hear anything? Oh, wow. Okay, that works. Okay. I'll have to hold it. All right. Okay, I'm just going to have to hold it. Okay, so continuing onwards, just for those of you who didn't hear, contrastive analysis and what it did was very important for language education generally and second language education. And a lot of course materials and methodologies were developed that relied on the assumptions of contrastive analysis. So we're just going to do a bit of a deep dive as quickly as I can that just looks at a bit of the methodology of this form of analysis. So how does it work? And so firstly, we describe, as it were, what's the thing that you are contrasting. So then within that, you would select elements of it. Actually, I think this will probably come out a bit easier if we go into details. You contrast, and then the final one, if you can, you would predict the difficulty or the ease with which someone would be able to learn a language habit. Okay, so I was talking a lot about difficulty. One of the things that emerged then as contrastive analysis became a thing was that people then tried to figure out, well, what are the levels of difficulty within a language and as you learn a language? So Stockwell, Bowen, and Martin had an initial attempt, and then Praetor revised it. So you can see that pyramid there is, I think, Praetor's pyramid, which has a, right at the very top, which is the easiest, and then at the bottom is the hardest. And we'll go through all of those: transfer, coalescence, under differentiation, reinterpretation, over differentiation, and splits. I think they're very badly named, to be honest. I'm very glad that this theory isn't particularly used anymore. But I think more than focusing on the names of these levels, we'll look at some examples rather. So when there's no difference whatsoever, you've done your contrastive analysis between a certain element of language, in this case, pluralization. So English, the S, like we saw in the previous example, and Spanish S, you just add an S to indicate something is a plural. Then for English, mortal, to say that it's a mortal wound, or in the case of Spanish, it's the same word, you just maybe would say mortal. So you'd shift the emphasis or the stress towards the end. But it's the same word, has the same meaning, just a difference in pronunciation. And then similarly also, I've, which is a contraction of I have, is like j'ai or j'ai in French, which is I have as well. Okay, so there's absolutely no difficulty there. If you're a language learner and then you encounter one of your target language or your second language, you're not going to have any difficulty learning those elements of the language. I wonder if I can increase the volume in this thing. Can you hear me at the back though, actually? Okay, you can, cool. Sorry, just tell me if I'm shouting because I have no sense of how loud this is. All right, so whereas for coalescence is not that difficult, so it's only level 1 difficulty. And that's where there are 2 items in your first language, but not in the target language. So this is quite easy. If you have 2 ways of describing something or doing something in language, and suddenly it's simpler in your target language. You do have to get used to it, but it's quite an easy change. So in Spanish, to refer to his or her, you would just say su, easy. Okay, so you come from a place of complexity going to something that's more simple. And then similarly, Afrikaans, Viet, and Ken, and it's just no in English. Okay, then going slightly more difficult, according to contrastive analysis. Again, the question is it really as difficult as they say it is? So I want you to be thinking about that as we go through these examples. English has the TH, right? So that's the IPA symbol for it. And then we also have obviously a voiced version, the and tha, which doesn't have your throat getting involved. And Afrikaans doesn't have that sound. Similarly, isiZulu doesn't either. And then, so that's looking more at the level of pronunciation and phonology. But then in terms of he and she and pronouns, for instance, also doesn't have that. It just has kind of one pronoun that could refer to he, she, or some other object that is not a person even, that would use that same pronoun. Okay, so going up the level to reinterpretation, it exists in both the first and second language, but things work in different ways. So for instance, pluralization. So in English, we'd put an S at the end, usually, not always. But then in Xhosa, for instance, instead of having something at the end, it would be something at the beginning that would indicate plurality. So in this case, it would be maybe originally it was izinja, and you deleted the Z, and then it's inja, or something like that. But that's obviously, it's the same way you would have a singular form of a word and a plural form. So it's like English in that respect, but there's a different way of pluralizing. So that requires you almost to reinterpret your own internal rules for how to make a word plural and to learn a different way. But at least the same concept, like pluralizing something, works. And then similarly with the other example there as well. Child, children, mntwana, abantwana. Okay, so over differentiation, this is I think a bad name for it, but let's look at what the example is and you'll get it. So it's when it exists in the target language, but it's not in your L1. So we don't have, in English, we don't mark a noun for gender. We wouldn't say that the table is masculine or feminine. The table is just a table. Whereas in German, in French, in many European languages and other languages around the world, it's called, I guess, grammatical gender. You would add a gender to something. And that kind of creates certain associations in your mind that certain words are feminine or masculine or whatever. But English doesn't have that. So you would have to learn that. And I think, I mean, I can personally speak as a learner of German, getting used to where something is der, die, or das, or, you know, whether a table is indeed masculine or feminine. It's a really weird thing to get your mind around. There is difficulty remembering that because you just don't have the concept for it from your mother tongue, right? And then similarly, as many of us are aware, there are no articles in also, so I will meet you at shops would often be for someone who finds it difficult to remember that English has a or the, you would just delete them because you don't have the equivalent in your mother tongue. Okay, and the most difficult level is when you have one item or one thing in your first language and it becomes two or more in the target language. So I've given some examples here. Afrikaans has jy or julle to differentiate between plural you or singular you. English is just you. English actually originally didn't just have you. You would have thou, which would refer to one person. And I think it was thee. No. It's been a while since I looked at Anglo-Saxon. But originally, we also had this differentiation. But languages sometimes get more complex over time. Sometimes they get simpler. English got simpler. We just bunched it all together. It's you. But yeah, so I had a question there. Who is this difficult for? So if you were an English person learning also or Afrikaans, would it be difficult? Or would it be difficult the other way around? What do you think? Going from Afrikaans to English is difficult, or English to Afrikaans? It's pretty obvious, yeah. Okay, so we're kind of reaching maybe the end of this section now. I hope I'm not going too fast. So there's three positions you can take on contrastive analysis. And I guess there's a hypothesis that's behind it. And the hypothesis is that errors in the second language can be predicted by identifying the differences, so contrasting the two languages and the various features of those languages. And so that's what you would call the strong hypothesis for contrastive analysis. It can get less strong though, so because that would in effect say all the errors can be predicted. But then the question is, well, can you find some errors that can't be predicted? And if you can, it would invalidate this theory, or at least this hypothesis, sorry. And then the medium hypothesis is that it's not trying to be as kind of general, and it's not using the word all, but it's just saying that the main source of errors in L2 is due to interference from the L1. So again, it's relying on the assumption that it's all about you have these language habits in your L1, and they transfer or interfere as you learn your L2. So it's still trying to claim that the majority of the errors are coming from the differences between L1 and L2. And then finally, the weak hypothesis, which I think is now where many people would place themselves. They would agree that contrastive analysis, and then obviously you can explain some of the errors, but it can really only explain the difficulties, but not all the linguistic difficulties can be explained in advance. So in effect, that there are other factors that explain difficulty alongside it. And it's not always that one kind of feature of a language, for instance, the way that it does plurals, is going to predict whether that thing is difficult or not. And we'll see later in the lecture, there are some things that, according to contrastive analysis, they think a learner would struggle with, but actually they just get it. And so sometimes this, as a means for predicting errors, it just doesn't work. Okay, so yeah, some of the criticisms, I guess we're focusing on the strong version, which is a very broad claim it's making. All L2 errors can be predicted. And yeah, it ignores other factors, and then also it can overpredict, so it can in effect say more than actually occurs in real life, certain errors would occur. And then again, so the question is, well, why is it not predicting the right level of errors? But then sometimes it can underpredict, where there are strange errors that just don't make sense if you did a contrastive analysis of two languages. So again, what this all suggests then is that there's something wrong with the fundamental assumptions of contrastive analysis as a way of looking at second language learning. So yeah, difference does not always predict difficulty. And yeah, we need to consider the role of other languages with which the learner speaks, but also maybe something that's just inborn in their heads as well. And this is kind of where it gets into universal grammar. We won't be going there in this lecture, but there are other things going on. It's not just about a structural examination of L1 and L2, how they differ, how they're similar. It's more complex than that. So yeah, just closing remarks on this section then. Errors were the result of interference. You can kind of remember that as just a way of what contrastive analysis kind of claimed and the assumption, but that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's almost certainly not true. It's more the weak hypothesis coming back here that it can explain difficulties, but it cannot comprehensively explain and predict them. Okay, so contrastive analysis was very popular in the 50s and 60s, but then there was a change in kind of the theoretical way of looking at second language acquisition and learning. And something else came out of it that was kind of based on it, but it didn't want to say that everything almost came down to the analysis of the two. It was trying to take into account more factors. And that's where we get to error analysis. Okay, I'm just going to pause quickly. So obviously, contrastive analysis it's very interested in errors and in predicting errors, but it wasn't just focused on that. It was also focused on where there would be positive language transfer, for instance. And so error analysis is interesting because it largely just focuses on errors, almost to the exclusion of other things. And this is one of the critiques then that come towards it later on. But it definitely grew out of the desire to, well, let's look at the things that people are actually saying rather than looking at the languages that they are either learning or they already have. So one is almost looking now at the person who is producing language as opposed to the languages that they are said to either already have or that they are learning, kind of divorced from the person. So this is now, I think, looking at real data as opposed to just pie in the sky ideas about how languages are different and how people should be or not should be learning them. Okay, so, and this is from Selinka, who came up with something that I haven't really stressed too much in this lecture, but you'll see it in the reading. He came up with the concept of interlanguage, which may be encountered in first language acquisition, probably not, I'm not sure. But he then said that, in effect, the errors are not random, they're systematic. And they are not negative or interfering in any way with learning a target language, but are, on the contrary, a positive factor that's indicative of testing hypotheses. So just to kind of go into what he's talking about there is that errors are not bad, but errors show that something is going on in terms of a learner developing systems for understanding how a new language functions. And this is, we've already encountered the term overgeneralization. It very much came from error analysis as a way of describing an error that tends to happen. So, and that's where you overgeneralize a certain rule that you think is true. As you speak your second language, there are certain things that you think are true, but then actually there's exceptions or many exceptions, or you are misapplying a rule. There's lots of different errors that you can be making. So I guess error analysis is just looking and trying to figure out what are all the types of errors that you can make. Okay, so Pitt Corder is also kind of a pioneer within error analysis. And okay, so maybe we can skip this, but yeah, so it studies the types and causes of learners' errors. And I think one of the things that also comes out that instead of contrastive analysis, which is looking at how languages differ or are the same, this is focusing more, like I was saying, on actual learners and they're constructing something creatively based on their first language stuff that they have in their brains already and that the habits that they have, but also as they're engaging now with the rules that they think exist in the second language. And there's a kind of a creative process that's going on. So error analysis seeks to kind of recognize that there is a creative process. It's not just that they are, following the habits of their L1 and then trying to apply it to their L2. It's more complex than that. They actually are creating something new. And this is also where the idea of interlanguage comes in, where they're almost creating their own version of a language, right? And I mean, we also spoke about fossilization in a previous lecture, and sometimes that's how you could see how fossilization happens, where as a learner, you almost develop your own version of English or German or Chinese or whatever it might be. And because you get so used to whatever rules or that you might be using to create your version of Chinese, say, if you do that long enough and you aren't corrected or you don't try and correct yourself, it might fossilize. And then you've got like these language fossils that you constantly are bringing back up, which aren't like proper, so to speak. People will probably understand you though. Anyway, so that's an aside. Yeah, so again, error analysis is based on actual learner errors. It's not based on just, I guess, a theoretical view of two languages and doing a comparison between them. Okay, and one of the things that they make a contrast between mistakes and errors. So mistakes are errors when you are performing language. So it has the competence of the speaker. So you might be quite competent in a language, but occasionally you would just actually make an error where maybe you mispronounce something, but it has nothing to do with kind of an internal rule that you are overgeneralizing or something like that. So there's nothing systematic about mistakes. They just occur now and then. It's also not significant. There's not some underlying reason for it. It's just sometimes you're shocked and then you mispronounce something because your throat jumped in your mouth or whatever. It's occasional, so it's not systematic, obviously, unintentional. And you can just correct yourself because you actually know the right thing. So that's a mistake. And we have to distinguish mistakes versus errors. So errors then would be things that occur because of a lack of competence, so a lack of fundamental understanding of what you are doing, and then also where you are deviating from, I guess, the standard grammar or standard way of saying something that a first language native speaker would have. So it's systematic. An error would be systematic and consistent. It would occur repeatedly. And it's a result of transitional competence. So in effect, you've got your interlanguage, and it's like you creatively constructing it as you're trying to reach that goal of like a first language standard. But it's transitional. Things are moving. You don't, like, your rules are not fixed at that stage. Importantly, you don't know how to correct yourself as well. So that's where it would be an error. You're not like, as soon as you say it, you're not like, oh, wait, I misspoke. And then it reflects, I guess, an incomplete or inaccurate learning of language rules. So does John can sign? That would be, I think, an error there in that it's reflecting, it's asking kind of two things, whether John is able to sign or whether in fact he is doing it or not. And especially when you have, I guess in English, not all languages, but most do, where you would have helping verbs as well. In this case, it's using two helping verbs. So can John sign would be correct, but this is does John can sign. There's probably some kind of language interference going on there. Okay, but anyway, so in terms of classification of errors, there's two main ones that in error analysis you'd use, interlingual and intralingual. So inter is between two languages, intra is within a language. So the interlingual would be transfer errors, where you are trying to transfer something from L1 to L2. But then it's because of the effect of the L1. And then intralingual is where, like I've mentioned many times now, overgeneralization, where you think there's a rule within a language, but you're just misapplying it. Okay, so not all the errors are because your mother tongue is interfering. And again, this is a difference, an important difference from contrastive analysis. At the differences, contrastive analysis, that should be learner utterances, not Lena. It's focusing on what Actually, so according to this, at least, it's looking at both of them. I'd probably say, actually, you want to edit this more. Let me go back. But yeah, I think the second row there and the third rows are more relevant just in terms of seeing the differences where an idealized hypothetical problem is what contrastive analysis is looking at. It's not looking at the actual problems that learners are coming up with. And then also, interestingly, the errors that it looks at are almost always just between languages. It assumes that there aren't any errors that you would come up with from within a language. And that's because it just doesn't have the theoretical or the assumptions that there's something going on beyond. You've got like your first language and the habits from that. So it's assuming that there's always a carryover, that there isn't some kind of habits that you could develop without an L1, as it were helping you to develop them. Okay, so we're just going to run through then a few examples of this, but obviously you collect data, you're trying to identify, okay, this is an error, this is an error, this is an error. Then you would classify them. So the two would be, you just see it visually, you'd see, oh, this doesn't look right. Then you try and understand, well, what kind of error is it? And then you'd quantify and see, well, how many errors within this extract of text or extract of speech, how often is this error occurring? Is it systematic, right? So that's what they're interested in. Otherwise, it might just be a mistake. And then you would also try and analyze, well, what is the source of this error? Where is it coming from? Remediation would then, I guess, be, well, how can this error be corrected? And that's probably also the in terms of the stage which is most relevant to language teaching. Okay, so looking at sources of errors, here's some examples. The people they come, and that's where there's some transfer interference. Similarly, like with French, I am boring. I don't think they meant to say I am boring. They're probably saying I am bored. But maybe in French, the word for boring is also like a present participle. It sounds like it's an ing word. And then they just misapplied that. So it's because of the first language, then they said something that's an error in the second language. So there's interference. And then intralingual, these are examples of errors that just emerge from within the language system, your second language that you're picking up. He can sings. So just think about why someone might come up with he can sings. So you would have a sentence, he sings, and that's good. You put the S at the end because it's a singular he. If you say he sing, that wouldn't sound right. They sing would be fine. Okay, so there's something going on there. And now you want a helping verb to indicate ability. So you put that in, but then you forget to modify and remove the S. And so that's where within a language, there's a rule that when you have a helping verb, any of the markers of plurality would then drop off. So that's an example of an intralingual error. So there's a couple others there, which maybe you can just try and figure out why they're intralingual and why it's not kind of the source is not your L1 necessarily. Okay, yeah, so I mean, these are overgeneralization. Almost intralingual ones would just be overgeneralizing a rule that you think applies. Okay, so there's a few kind of types of errors that are intralingual. So an induced error. So he walks quickly, which then he is walks quickly. So the idea here is that as you're being taught, maybe your language teacher said, well, when you want to put something into the present continuous tense, so something that's happening right now, you're in the process of it, all you need to do is you just put in your helper verb of is, and then it works, right? And then they maybe didn't mention that you also need to transform your main verb into the present participle as well, right? So you can maybe see here then he is walks quickly. Should be saying he is walking quickly, but whoever said this didn't realize that they needed to transform walks into its present participle. They couldn't just use the present tense version of it. And that's kind of induced. It's because maybe of lack of correct instruction, or they misheard how the rule works. So she didn't went to the store. In this case, it's in the past that whoever she is. So the sentence, whoever's making the sentence up, obviously it's in the past. So they want to keep that verb go in the past tense because she went to the store is correct. She didn't went to the store. They don't realize that actually you need to change it to just the unmarked version that doesn't show past or present after a helping verb. So anyway, those are induced errors. Then there's also simplification errors. So yesterday I go to the university and meet my new professor. And this is where, you could argue that they're not recognizing the need. And you could say that maybe like a Spanish speaker might say something like this, where they don't always need to indicate tense. You can just use present tense as long as you have something like yesterday or tomorrow. It's not strictly correct from what I understand, but people often say this. But they've simplified things in English, maybe because it's convenient and it's a linguistic habit that they're used to, but nonetheless, it's because they're not recognizing that they need to put the verb always into the correct tense based on the time word that they're using yesterday. So I am hearing him. You'd probably say, I hear him. And like all the reasons for why we use certain tenses are really difficult for learners, particularly if they don't have the equivalent tense in their own language. So then there's a tendency to simplify as a result. But again, like what is the source of that error? This is a question that comes up and again in error analysis. And sometimes it's really difficult to figure it out. So I saw many bird. Obviously, many indicates plurality. So maybe whoever's made up the sentence will think, well, I've already said many. I don't need to say birds, right? The S at the end. But again, it's kind of an error where they're simplifying things that should be a bit more complex. He likes sports, avoiding the way that English uses negation. He does not like sport. And obviously, there's a lot of changes then that you'd have to make to a sentence like he likes sport to change it into the negative. No is just super simple. You can just put in there, people will understand you. Okay. Anyway, I think it's pretty obvious what simplification is compared to overgeneralization. But it's just about reducing the complexity of a sentence due to limited proficiency or knowledge. Okay. Some other types, and ignorance of a rule. So that's where you just literally do not know the rule. And that's maybe because you haven't learned it yet, you haven't encountered it enough times. So she speaks English very good. What would the rule here be? Does this sound right? So the rule is like, it's actually an irritating one. I'd say first language English speakers sometimes would just they'd be very happy to say sentences like this. But when what are we modifying? We're modifying the way that she speaks, right? So we would then say she speaks English very well. And we make a distinction then in English between good and well. Well is the adverb, good is the adjective. You can say he is a good learner. You wouldn't say he is a well learner. Doesn't sound right, but well applies to verbs. So in this case, whoever said this is completely ignorant of that rule, that the difference between adverbs and verbs. And obviously, we have a regular way of making adverbs out of adjectives. What would that be? So anyway, you guys can think about that. But he is very quick. I want to go quickly. So we have a ly that we usually add. And in this case, this is irregular, good and well. You wouldn't say goodly. She speaks English very goodly. If English were a regular language, that's how it would be. Me go to store, I'm going to the store. And that's where they probably just don't understand how to put things into the present tense or the present continuous. He made me go to rest. Yeah, and so on. So another one is just an incomplete grasp of a rule. So where you have some sense of what the rule is, and so you can see it in the example sentence that they're trying to do something here, but it's actually, they're not quite getting it. So when you will come to the meeting. And this is, English has this way, not all languages have this way, when you're making a statement into a question, you would then take the verb, and if it's a helping verb, you put the helping verb before the pronoun or the subject. So when will you come to the meeting is right, and not the other way around. I mean, in the case of some languages like Chinese, for instance, and I think also is similar as well, where you would just be able to have a statement like, he is going to the shop, and then you would just add a particle at the end, and maybe you'd rise your intonation just to show, is this a question? So is he going to the shop? In English, we have to put the is at the beginning. But in other languages like Chinese, you would just put ma at the end, or you'd use some other way of doing it. Okay, I'm just going to speed through this. Okay, so some of the problems with error analysis. Errors are just a surface phenomenon, right? So they don't always provide evidence for what's happening at a deeper level of second language acquisition. And so sometimes what the cause is, and trying to figure out what the cause is, it's ambiguous. You don't actually know, is it this rule that's going on here? Is it a mistake? Is it a mistake and a misapplied rule at the same time? So that's one element. The other element which critiques of this have made is that you also need to look at when people are actually doing things correctly, not just looking at the errors, in order to understand how second language acquisition is working. And one other element that you'll maybe see in the reading is that often when people speak, they have strategies to avoid ways of saying things that they often get wrong. So you'd have a strategy to say something correctly, but it's because you're avoiding something that you often make errors in, right? So error analysis doesn't have a way of taking that into account, that some people just maybe will use different ways to go around in order to use correct speech. Okay, so that's all for today. Error analysis and contrastive analysis. Your reading is available on Are You Connected and then the tutorial worksheet will be up by tomorrow morning in prep for Friday. All right, everyone, thanks for bearing with me. I know it is a lot of content, and have a good rest of your day.